a very warm welcome to BioLit Talks, Crossing Science with Humanities. I am Sofia Sandalli. I am a PhD student in infection biology at the University of Glasgow, and I will be one of the chairs for this evening. So I'm very excited to briefly introduce you to our two speakers. However, before we begin, as this is our very first event, I would like to say a few words to introduce you all to BioLit Talks. So BioLit Talks was born, well, on a personal level, it was born out of a strong interest in infectious diseases and a love of reading. But on a more general level, it is born out of the idea that biology and literature are two disciplines that undeniably feed into each other, and they have been doing so for a long time. Both biology and literature are two disciplines that ask questions. They are both disciplines that answer questions, although they do so in different ways. They both seek truth, whether that be a scientific, empirical truth, or whether that be a sort of genuine and accurate representation of what it means to be human. They both require communication, and they both deal with a lot of the same elements like novelty and mystery and beauty and creativity. And essentially, they're two disciplines that have been exchanging a dialogue for a long time, and they have been influencing each other. So just like some scientific advancements have influenced humanities' perspectives and the cultural outputs that have derived from it, likewise, some of the greatest scientific discoveries would not have come about if it hadn't been for a sort of nurturing cultural terrain. And when it comes to infectious diseases in particular, they provide an excellent framework around which to discuss the ways that biology and literature intersect and interact. So from a scientific point of view, infectious diseases have accompanied us since forever. And they are increasingly being researched and understood. They have had a huge impact in the past. They continue having a huge impact nowadays. And from a literary point of view, infectious diseases have served as the backdrop for countless of literary masterpieces, and they have been recurring themes and metaphors and sources of inspiration. So throughout this event series, we will be exploring the ways in which biology and literature color and shape each other, how they have developed alongside each other. And this will help us rethink the ways that we understand and portray and imagine infectious diseases. So in particular, tonight, we will be talking about novel and re-emerging pathogens and about the ways in which these two are portrayed in contemporary literature, not only their actual portrayal, but also the diverse implications that can derive from novel and re-emerging pathogens. The warming climate has a huge impact on novel diseases, so we are particularly enthusiastic about discussing these topics while the UN Climate Change Conference is taking place, and moreover, to be doing so right from Glasgow. So now I'd like to introduce you to my fellow co-chair for tonight, Michael Dearwater, who is a doctoral student in creative writing, also at the University of Glasgow. Over to you, Mike.
Thanks, Sophia. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Just to let you know how we're going to run things tonight. We're going to start with a short introduction from each of our speakers before we move into a discussion. During the discussion, please do all feel free to chat in our chat window, which will be running the whole time. We want it to be a kind of space for lively debate, and hopefully if you've got any specific questions, if you just write in that you've got a question to, and then whoever of the speakers, we'll loop back to those at the end of our discussion, when hopefully we'll leave about 10, maybe 15 minutes for your own thoughts. So yeah, please do be thinking and be active participants. And at the end of the session, totally, there will be a survey, so you can share with us what you thought about everything. So let's open with Professor Birgitta Evengård, who is a senior professor in infectious diseases at the Department of Clinical Microbiology in Umeå University, Sweden. She's worked as a clinician, teacher and researcher for more than 40 years with more than 150 publications in peer-reviewed journals. She's the author or editor of 11 books, 22 chapters, and has a citation index of more than 8,500. Her recent focus has been One Health, researching the impact of climate change on ecosystems, the health of humans and animals, and on the development of societies in the North. She coordinates the Nordic Centre of Excellence and is presently part of the Lancet Commission on Arctic Health, the Arctic Council Project Biosecurity in the Arctic, and EU PolarNet 2, Human Health and Wellbeing. Over to you, Birgitta.
Oh, hello, everybody, and thank you for asking me to participate. I'm really very honored by this. I know many of you are in the beginning of your careers, at least some of you, and I've been asked to be a bit personal about my own journey, so to say. I just turned 69, you know, I'm still working, although it's more part-time and on my own conditions. But I would like to say a few words, actually. I felt I was, well, it will explain itself. So I come from a family of farmers. I'm the first one who took a PhD. I was born in the beginning of the 50s, then after the Second World War. And I was offered this opportunity with free education and what we call the Swedish smorgasbord of opportunities that we had coming out as we did, as we were neutral during the Second World War. We had a rather smooth first years after that war. And I had all the opportunities, and I was a good student, and I did my work, and my family just wanted me to be happy and do whatever. I had all the freedom. I lived in a fantastic part of the world, especially for a woman, during a very special time. And this time seems to be fading away. So at least it could be, and we're moving into serious contexts, and that's why I'm doing what I'm doing. What happened to me because of this political situation that we had, a democracy that offered opportunities to everyone. I had the opportunity to go to the United States as a 17-year-old. I went 1 year to school at a Catholic nun school, and stayed with an American family. And the American way of life became very, you know, it was well known to me. So after this, I've been very much collaborating, not with British people, but rather with the United States. I've had the opportunity to work as a student at Harvard, and as a postdoc at University of California in Irvine, and as a professor, I've spent some time at Columbia University in New York. So glorious times we have lived in this part of the world. And of course, all of this broadened my mind. I traveled around the United States on a Greyhound bus as 18 years old. And then I went back to Stockholm and started to my medical education at Karolinska Institute. And I did my PhD there, and I became a specialist in infectious disease. I started medical education because I was interested in psychiatry and working with people, but infectious diseases is really a very fascinating field, and I can just say it's getting, of course, more and more important. And as Sophia said at the introduction, it has been with us. Well, they were there, the bacteria, before Homo sapiens, Homo sapiens and all the apes were there, of course. So I'm just surprised that it's not more depicted in humanities than it is, because we're living so close to it. Anyway, I became a specialist in infectious diseases and also in clinical immunology, working with people that had immunodeficiencies. Because if you want to study what is normal, I figured one way would be to see where it faltered, you know, and from there you can move on to see what's normal. I worked a lot with parasitology, brought me a lot to Africa. I've been in different parts of Africa working, sometimes as a doctor, but more as a researcher. I built and had a house on Zanzibar on the shore of the Indian Ocean for like 12 years. Made many good friends there. Well, going back to what my life in academia at Karolinska Institute, I must say it was a shock to come from a very democratic school, a democratic family, into academia and see the gender differences. this was long before Me Too, but it's been a long journey where Me Too has been, hitting us, me and my pals, my girl pals, all along. And I worked a lot with gender equality, published a lot, and I became quite well known for this. And I was actually asked by politicians to work with gender equality in healthcare part-time for 4 years. Very good years of my life, I would say, although it was, it took a lot of effort. But anyway, because it's not only a matter of being in the academia, I mean, human resources, but also what you do, both in your research, how do you apply gender and sex in your research, disaggregated data, and how do you do it in healthcare? I won't go into this, it's a big thing, but we actually discovered that men and women, and I'm not talking about reproductive health, I'm talking about heart infarctions, kidney diseases, blah, blah, blah. Men and women get not what they should according to their sex, but rather what people think they should have. And this is another matter I published, so you can look it up. We published on psoriasis, actually. It's in English. Anyway, I worked then with parasitology and also chronic fatigue syndrome because it interested me. I think maybe with this background of mine, I had the freedom to do whatever I wanted. And I thought the patients were there, they were fatigued, and I worked with it. And that brought me back to the States and worked a lot with CDC in Atlanta. And then I worked also with the tropical medicine. And then in 2007, I became the first female professor ever in infectious diseases with a chair, 1 out of 5 in Sweden, at Umeå University. So I took that. And then people asked me, so what are you going to study? What are you going to do your research on now? Because that's a job, that's 1/3 head physician with patients and 1/3 teaching and 1/3 research. So I said, well, I think people up in the north are interested that I use the taxpayers' money because they gave me a lot of money to look into the future, and that's going to be climate change and the transition of infectious diseases. And that's why I'm here today, because species are moving up to the north, where they're actually moving to the poles. So anyway, I received later on money from the Nordic Council of Ministers, and we have had that for 5 years. It's called CLINF, CLINF.org. And during this, it's just finishing up. During these 5 years, I've been on a publication in Science, and we just had one of the Nature publications. We had one paper published in Scientific Reports and other publications that you can look at if you're interested. Anyway, that's where I am today. Is that?
Right. That's a wonderful introduction. Thanks, Birgitta. And it's really good to have all of that information to look back to, because it's clear you've had not just a varied career, but a varied life. And I think the breadth of experience there will be very interesting in our later discussion. But before I get ahead of myself, I'll introduce our second speaker tonight, Katie Hale. Katie was born in Cumbria and is an internationally recognised poet and novelist. Her debut novel, My Name is Monster, has been translated into multiple languages and was shortlisted for the Kitschy's Golden Tentacle Award. Her second poetry pamphlet, Assembly Instructions, won the Munster Chapbook Prize, and a MacDowell Fellow. Oh, you're a MacDowell Fellow. She won a Northern Writers Award in 2021 and has been shortlisted for the Desperate Literature, Dyslexia, and Manchester Prizes. You've got too many accolades for me, Katie. She's also written for theatre and immersive digital performance, and has featured on national radio and television. She's currently working on her second novel. So yes, over to you, Katie. Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry, I like to just flash the book whenever it's mentioned, because I mean, my publicist isn't here, but I feel as though she's sort of always watching, and she likes it when I flash the book. So yeah, it almost becomes like a game. So yeah, thank you, Mike, and thank you very much for having me. I'm seeing other people flashing the book now. This is great. It feels like audience participation. So as Mike said, I'm a poet and novelist. I'm based in Cumbria. I was born here, but I live here still, just south of the England-Scotland border. So I've always been fascinated by borders and edgelands and what it means really to be in that kind of in-between state and to belong in a state of betweenness. And My Name is Monster kind of feeds into that. It's my debut novel. Just sort of briefly, a kind of introduction to the plot of the book. So following an apocalyptic event, which includes devastating sickness, fitting for tonight, My Name is Monster is the story of a woman who believes herself to be the last person left alive on Earth until she finds a girl. So in many ways, the book is a retelling of Robinson Crusoe, and through that it seeks to interrogate Robinson Crusoe's colonial approach to power, and the themes of enslavement and the, quote, civilization of Friday, but through a post-apocalyptic female lens. But it also has its roots in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which is perhaps more relevant to what we're going to be talking about tonight, this relationship between science and art and the possibilities of the two. So the title, you might have guessed, My Name is Monster, is a direct reference to Frankenstein. It references the idea of Frankenstein's monster. Although if there are any Shelley aficionados in the room, you might know that Shelley never actually refers to Dr. Frankenstein's creation as a monster. That's something that's come through our kind of popular culture and later adaptations of the book. But like Frankenstein, my novel deals with themes of creation and what responsibility we have for the things that we create. So when the woman, the main character, the monster of the title, when she finds the girl, she names the girl Monster after herself and changes her own name to Mother. Mother then attempts to civilize the girl and to raise her in her own image. But I think anyone who's ever either been a parent or had a parent will know that there comes a point in parents and children's lives when, you know, personalities start to splinter, either slightly or very dramatically. And I think certainly every writer knows that we can never truly control the things that we create. And so this might be something, I don't know if this will come up later in the discussion, in connection with disease and also in connection with climate collapse and responsibility we have for the planet. But one of the questions that the novel asks, and actually also what the novel I'm working on now asks as well, is once a situation is created, once something is set in motion, to what extent can or should we try and control it, and what responsibility do we have as human creators? And that's probably an eternal writer's question as well, in that sort of slightly self-obsessed way that writers have of always writing about their own existential problems. So geographically, My Name is Monster starts in the Arctic, and it takes us down to the north of England. So the first maybe third of the book is a kind of journey novel. And that's something else I've always been fascinated by, as well as borders, is this idea of the north. You know, so I've said that I live in Cumbria. I live about maybe 2 miles, I'm looking over there like I can see it. I live about 2 miles from the M6 motorway, just over there. And I always have done pretty much my whole life. And when I was a child, we'd get on the motorway and we'd drive north to our nearest town, which is Penrith. Sometimes we'd drive up to Carlisle if it was, a big shopping day, which is obviously just below the England-Scotland border. And occasionally we would drive up into Scotland. And I always had this idea of the motorway as this kind of magical route that could convey me north. I never had quite the same pull to the motorway south, which is weird because all my relatives lived that way. That might explain it, I don't know. But I had this idea of this sort of magical pull north, and the motorway could pull me north, and that as a child sitting in my bedroom, I was connected to, the Arctic, and I don't know how far north could the motorway take you. As a child, I didn't really know the limits of such things. And I think that idea of connection is probably something that will come up again tonight as well. So the book, when I was writing the book, I thought of it a bit like a stage play. And if it were a stage play, it would be the kind of two-hander that you would see in a really small venue, a kind of a focused studio theatre with an audience of maybe 40 or 50 people, 2 actors, maybe a very bare stage where everything is focused on the relationship between the 2 characters. And so to begin with, when I was writing the book, the whole idea of the sickness is this instigating factor and something that essentially gets rid of all the extraneous characters, slightly more complicated than that, was basically just an excuse to get these 2 characters on their own and to give them no other recourse to turn to other people, and no respite really in the form of other characters. And I think that's probably something that, you know, a lot of us are a lot more familiar with now than certainly than I was when I was writing the book, you know, having experienced lockdowns and different kinds of isolation because of COVID. But obviously, the more I wrote the novel, the less it became this sort of device simply to get the characters in a room on their own, and the more that obviously this sickness and this traumatic event started to shape the characters and the course of the novel, and these real questions of how we rebuild society after a traumatic event, but also how we rebuild ourselves as well. And again, maybe that's something that we will come into. I think it's worth saying that I started writing the book in October 2016. So for those of you with your recent election history hats on, might have realised that that was just after the Brexit referendum and just before the US elections, which saw Trump elected into office. I'm not going to go into politics, at least not those politics, not right now. But I think whatever your political allegiance and whatever your views on the outcome of those 2 elections, I think it's hard not to argue that they were very divisive, and they've, I think, changed or at least developed the way that we think about truth. We've had the emergence of terms such as post-truth and alternative facts that have followed both of those elections, where different versions of the same stories fight for supremacy. And I think this is something that we're seeing again now with COVID. You know, the great thing about the democracy of the internet is that anyone can have a voice, but that means that you get well-researched scientific data posited against side, you know, your uncle who's just read something on Wikipedia and has run it past your aunt while she's doing the washing up. You know, there isn't, I think a lot of people struggle to tell the difference between those 2 things, or to put the effort in to tell the difference, and it's something that can be worrying, but it's also something that as a writer that fascinates me, that different versions of narrative and how we can all experience the same narrative but have our own version of it in our heads. And so just a bit about the structure of the book. So the book is in 2 halves. The first half is told from Mother's perspective. The second half is told from Monster's perspective. And so we start to see where the cracks are and where their truths butt up against each other. So I'm going to read a little section from the book. It's only about a page, so don't worry, but feel free to have a little shift around if you want to, I don't know, get comfortable for story time. And it's a section about loneliness, or the aftermath of loneliness. And again, this is something that I think is this page, when I was thinking about what to read for tonight, resonates differently with me, certainly now, than it did when I wrote it probably 3 or 4 years ago. So it comes near the start of the book, and Mother, who at this point is still Monster, is walking south through Scotland. This morning I buried a sparrow. I don't know what made me do it. It was outside a once whitewashed crofter's cottage at the foot of a mountain. I thought there could be food in the kitchen. Instead, I found a table set with 2 teacups, each one lined with a fuzzy green and white mould. Upstairs, damp curtains blew at an open window, and something lay sprawled in the middle of the bed. As I entered the room, I upset the flurry of crows that had gathered to steal its softer parts. They cawed and scuffled and scratched at me as I barreled backwards. Scarf tight over my nose and mouth, I checked the empty kitchen cupboards and left. As I stepped back onto the road, I crunched something into the tarmac. A sparrow. A small, speckled bump on the wet black road, trying vainly to lift its head and chirrup. I bent down to scoop it up. It was soft and firm, like a tennis ball. It quivered in my hands, a bundle of terrified warmth. At the end of the last century, London lost 3/4 of its sparrows in just 6 years. One of those facts I read and inexplicably remembered, and nobody really cared. So what difference did another sparrow make? But it was as if a cloud had stuffed itself into my throat. I struggled to breathe. My eyes went sharp. I fell to the road and clutched this ordinary bird to my chest. Maybe it was because of the broken wing, or the matchstick feet dangling from its juddering stomach. Maybe because this was the first living body I had touched in weeks. I put it out of its misery with a rock from the edge of the road, then buried it as best I could in a dip by the wall. I didn't leave a marker. Who was there to find it? I carried on walking south. Available from all good bookshops and a great Christmas present.
Wonderful, thank you, Katie. It's really great to hear that, and it's a very emotive scene. It reminds me of, we were speaking a little bit before we started the meeting proper and started admitting guests. One of the things, Birgitta, you were saying to us was about the importance of empathy and of engaging with these issues as they start. It would be great, Birgitta, to hear about how you think that these kinds of works of literature can help us engage with these complex topics, and biomedicine in particular.
Well, I certainly thought of exactly what our research now in this Nordic Center of Excellence, because what we state is that, I'm reading here, healthy ecosystems are a prerequisite for human health. And it seems like an obvious thing, but it is not out there. And it's still, even I was at COP26 last week, and I walked around, I saw nil events on One Health, which to us is the very essence of things right now, which it's so important to know environmental health, animal health, and human health. Why? Because we know that more than 70% of emerging infections come to us from animals. They are zoonosis. And you can see that with HIV, SARS, MERS, probably COVID as well. And when we got our Nordic Center of Excellence, I will just finish up here, but in 2016, people, actually infectious disease specialists, said to me, what are you going to, infectious diseases in the north, in the Arctic, what's the point? Just a few weeks later, we had the anthrax outbreak, if you remember, in northern Russia. And all of a sudden, this was a hot topic. And now we have COVID, obviously it's coming from the animal world. How it's another issue. But so of course, what you were writing is exactly, I mean, animals, humans, we're just all parts of nature. And it's just so amazing. When did humans lose reverence of nature? My last point here is, look at, if you who have children, like sit with a 2.5-year-old and look at the snail, they just can sit there for hours and look at the snail, maybe play a little, comfort it, feed it, and just look at it. And then, we don't have time, or we don't bother. Very few of us actually live in empathy with the world, with nature.
Katie, do you have any thoughts on that? It'd be great to hear how you kind of built up these things, because obviously yours is quite a complicated novel in this regard because of starting point, and also the complexities behind the characters.
Yeah, I think the thing about nature is really interesting and really important. And I mean, I'm not from a farming family, but I am from farm country. You know, Cumbria is very much an agricultural county historically, and still is in many places. And when I was writing the book, I was very keen that I didn't want to write a post-apocalyptic novel that would star somebody, you know, in a film would star somebody like Will Smith with a gun over his shoulder, walking through a ruined city, possibly fighting zombies. That wasn't the kind of book I wanted to write. And My Name is Monster is very much a rural novel. I mean, they go into cities, there is use of cityscape, but not to give too much away, they end up settling on a farm, and so much of survival is about what can be grown and what can be scavenged, but then how things that can be scavenged can be made to grow, and how that relationship with the land becomes incredibly important, and a kind of custodianship that is, you know, and actually for the characters in the book, it's not about caring for the land for its own sake. It's purely about survival. But as you start to care for the land in a very selfish way, you know, the more you're thinking long term, the more the land actually starts responding. And you know, I think the problems in farming, and you know, there are other people who can talk about this much more knowledgeably than I can. People like James Rebanks, for example, who's a great Cumbrian farmer and writer, talks about that once you start thinking kind of across multiple generations about how we care for the land and how we interact with the land, then that's when the land starts giving back to us. And it's only when we start trying to kind of over farm things in a very kind of fast farming here and now way that we end up, you know, stripping away topsoil, and we end up creating these problems where we have these unbalanced ecosystems, and that then creates, you know, it feeds into things like climate change and you know, spread of disease and displaced populations and all these things, which are all obviously so interlinked as well. So yeah, I don't know if that answers the question or opens up a million more.
I mean, both, which is good for a discussion. But one of the things that's interesting for me in this discussion is how muddy it becomes in our interactions with nature, because of even in that phrase, there's this implicit assumption that somehow nature is separate from us, and that we are these beings inside our heads looking at and either maximizing the value from, in the case of farming nature, or trying to fix it or step back from, in the case of, say, rewilding. And I wonder if that's another space where both of your disciplines can really help us. Is, you know, Birgitta, from your point of view, perhaps in terms of researching those interconnectednesses, and Katie, obviously, as a writer, the affordances of the novel in terms of really emotionally connecting us to these interconnected environments above and beyond it. And that doesn't, and when I say emotively, I don't just mean that we idealize it, because that's a separation too. I mean, you know, that this is survival, that there are deeper connections. It'd be great to hear both of your thoughts about the ways that your disciplines can do that.
Can I start?
Of course, please.
You know, who lives close to nature? Well, we have indigenous peoples. So, and in Europe, we have one indigenous people, and that's the Sami people. And I would say the Sami people who live up north in Norway, Sweden and Finland, and a few of them also in Western Russia, many of them are reindeer herders, and they live close to nature, and they have done so thousands of years. So, and all over the world, I think, maybe it's because I'm more in this world than many others, but I think I see more and more in the papers about indigenous peoples, and of course the rights of indigenous peoples, because they have really been, if you look at Australia, for example, and also, of course, the Indians in North America, etc. It's amazing how mistreated they have been and moved around, shuffled around. And today we have to collaborate with them. In our Nordic Center of Excellence, we have, of course, indigenous peoples involved, and we could have done it better, but we have had it as one gender, and indigenous knowledge has been a part of everything we have done. do you know, for example, that in northern Russia, we work a lot with Russians. In northern Russia, there are 32 different peoples who speak at least 12 different languages. And yeah, it's just fascinating to meet them. So there is a lot of knowledge. And when you, Michael, say we, who are you referring to? Is it, you know, these people, or is it urban people? Or because even Katie and I, coming from farming country, we have another background than many urban people. And maybe that has shaped us to do what we do. Yeah, over to you, Katie.
Yeah, and I think what I would add to that is this thing of yeah, I guess going back to what Michael was saying about not being separate, you know, humans not being separate from nature. One of the great things that you always get taught on writing courses, like one of the first things they tell you when you do a writing course is always show, don't tell, which basically is about, you know, there's a quote by, I think, Chekhov, which is something like, don't tell me it's a cold evening, show me the glint of moonlight on broken glass. You know, it's about giving the reader a picture. And I think tied in with that is this idea of, you know, don't tell us what's going on in a character's head, show them physically engaging with the world and a part of the world. And I think part of the way we do that is by recognizing the animalness of people. You know, I mean, humans are different from animals in the way and the extent to which we exploit and shape the world around us. There are animals that do that, but I think not to the same extent as humans. But at the end of the day, we are all physical beings, we are all creatures, and so the way that we interact with the world around us, I think as a writer, that's something that you have to remember, you know, that the place that you're setting the novel, the place that you're writing about, is made of the same substance as the characters who you're creating and who are interacting with it and part of it and digging themselves into the earth of it.
I think those were some really beautiful reflections, because it was so apparent. You had both touched on the concept of a border, and the concept of One Health is one that doesn't essentially see borders. And likewise, Katie, before when you were giving us a bit of an introduction, you mentioned that you'd always had a bit of a fascination with borders. So given what you've just mentioned, both of you, would you like to delve a bit more into how borders are or aren't perceived in your respective disciplines?
Ooh, Birgitta, do you have anything on that, or do you want me to go first? Okay, so I think, so for me personally, borders have always been a kind of space in and of their own right. So the border between England and Scotland, historically, there were border reivers who were, if you believe a lot of the stories say that the border reivers were Scottish people stealing sheep from English people stealing sheep from Scottish people. That's actually a huge oversimplification. It's the people who lived in the borders never saw themselves as English or Scottish. They saw themselves as borderers, and the kind of this sheep stealing and, you know, house burning and all the rest of it that went on was actually it's clan feuds. And some of those clan feuds still, you can still find them in sort of some of the, you know, housing estates in Carlisle today. It's about family, and it's about where you are on the land, but you are very much of the border, and that's what defines you. And I think that's something that certainly myself as a writer, and I know I've heard a lot of other writers speak about this, is this need to occupy that, you know, liminal is such an overused word, isn't it? But that liminal space between being part of something, being enough part of something that you can dig into the earth of it and really understand it, but also being able to take that step back and being able to view something with an outsider's eye and that critical eye that enables you to both create and edit and represent something in a piece of fiction. And it strikes me that, Birgitta, when you were saying about, you know, your practice as well, there's that sense of really kind of being involved in place and location, but also coming at it from, you know, your own personal background as well. And I wonder if that's something that you know, another element of practice that we have in common.
Yeah, I can see different. I have different perspectives on borders. Like from my personal life, as you said, as a female researcher, I have felt borders, but borders can also be crossed and changed, and I think that's an important message. Borders, very substantial borders, I can see when I work with Russia. I just applied for more money, and I hope I will have another 2 years, because I met some fantastic people in Russia. I must take the opportunity to say that. Colleagues who speak wonderful English and do wonderful research, and they have wonderful data, because that's what we need. We need really long-term data, and they have it in the archives from the Soviet Union, much more than we do. So these borders are very irritating, you know, these political borders. And but with Russian colleagues, we kind of, I don't know, once you establish and get out of these mental borders, you can always kind of fix things, it seems. Not always, maybe, but because we need access to this data and build up a trustful relationship. And then, of course, we have the borders between, which is very irritating, the disciplines in academia. That's why we are sitting here. That's why you young people are pushing the agenda, as young people always have done. And hopefully people, you know, even as an infectious disease specialist, you cannot really communicate with a neurologist, for example. I mean, it's you have your career in a very, very narrow field, and you're supposed to stay there, which I find very irritating. As I explained very, very briefly, I worked with fatigue, which now is becoming so important with post-COVID fatigue. And more people realize that we have new findings. We need to know more about what's happening inside the cells, and it's a universe in every cell. You know, something obviously has gone wrong. It's just that we haven't had the right methodology. Yeah, so borders are everywhere, but young people, remember, borders can change.
And I wonder if that's even more important when we're talking about novel pathogens, if we're talking about things that are going to emerge in the future as a result of climate change. You know, when we've seen with COVID, for example, that the massive requirement for communication across borders, and is this something that's only going to become more acute as these things inevitably happen? Yeah.
You know, that's why Russia is so important, because Russia is huge. Permafrost is covering 22% of the Earth. The biggest permafrost area is in Russia, and it's already thawing. We have 3 amazing big rivers, Ob, Yenisei, and Lena, in flowing northwards. And they bring with them huge masses of biomass of this thawing permafrost, containing what? We don't know. We have to be there. We have to do research with them and find out, because things are thawing from hundreds of thousands of years, and some genetic material can be quite stable.
I mean, that's quite a difficult thing to comprehend as somebody coming from like an arts and humanities background myself. And I don't know, Katie, when you were writing My Name is Monster, obviously, you know, most people didn't survive the sickness. Is this part of the reason that you see it falling apart the way it did, is because of this, you know, breakdown?
Yeah. So there's a book that I actually didn't read, and it didn't come out until after I'd published My Name is Monster, but a book by a science fiction writer called Adam Roberts, who it's the end of the world, but what are we really afraid of? And he basically breaks down different apocalypses into their history in literature, and also basically how likely they are to actually end the human race. And it's quite hopeful in that he basically concludes that none of these apocalypses will completely and utterly wipe out the human race, other than the heat death of the universe. but what is interesting is how these things, you know, he looks at these in isolation, whereas, as we've already discussed tonight, these things are all interconnected. You know, climate collapse is connected with disease, which is connected with hunger and poverty, which is obviously then connected with war and a kind of, you know, doubling down on borders, as we're seeing so much at the moment in the news. So yeah, I think that was my challenge, and certainly something that I very much wanted in the book, was there not to be this, you know, this one single event that wipes out all of humanity. It's one thing leads to another thing, which leads to another thing, and it's this sort of, this kind of closing in of humanity, and this kind of doubling down that ultimately becomes this destructive spiral. So yeah, I think for me that's where the sickness is one part of the apocalypse, for want of a better word, that starts the novel.
I think. Sorry, I will just briefly say before I let Sophia jump in with a question, we are going to move into audience questions soon. So if you haven't already written anything in the chat and you've got something on your mind, please do share it. Sorry, Sophia.
No, that's all good. So one of the things you both touched on was kind of the concept of civilization, and the concept of civilization, the concept of control, how this is changing, how this has led to where we are today, which is a lot more of a fragile position than where we used to be. So I'm thinking of the second half of the 20th century, when humans really felt a bit invincible and we started mass crop productions, incredible advancements in transports and things like that. And as I mentioned, we are in a position where we do feel a bit more fragile now. And I am wondering how this is translating in the scientific or artistic outputs that you are witnessing as part of your disciplines.
I can say that funders, it's, you know, researchers do research where there's money. So it's a question of who is telling the funding bodies what to fund. And that's usually the citizens, in a way, through media. I've come to the conclusion that decision makers mostly read media. So if you put something up on the media, they will sooner or later start to fund that. And then you can work, as I do, in the structures, which is, for example, I work with EU PollenNet 2. I worked with for 5 years with EU PollenNet 1, where researchers put forward through different ways. Media is one of them, but reports, you know, summaries, one-pagers, one-liners, whatever, to the European Commission, what we think is important to fund in the Arctic, where the gaps of knowledge is. So funding bodies, researchers, most of the time do research where there is money. Isn't that correct, Sophia?
It is.
Yes.
Yeah, I think with fiction, it's maybe slightly different. There's a rule in fiction that you should never try and chase the zeitgeist, because the book takes so long to publish and manifest that essentially by the time you've published it, it's already out of fashion. So maybe it's a slightly different thing, but certainly something that I've felt in my practice is a need for hope, actually, in my writing. My Name is Monster originally had a very different ending, and as I was writing it, in all this, you know, kind of post all these elections and everything that was going on, I desperately needed there to be hope. I'm not going to tell you what happens in the end of the book, because, as I say, it makes a great Christmas present. Yeah, I definitely wanted there to be this element of hope, and it is a survival story, and I felt like I didn't want to write something completely bleak for, you know, however long it takes to write a book, 3.5 years, and I don't think readers necessarily want something completely bleak either. Maybe that's just my kind of Pollyanna outlook, but yeah, that's been the effect of this feeling of everything closing in that's had on my work.
That's interesting. I don't think it's just your outlook. I think a lot of us have these things on our mind. I mean, And I think working together can be a big part of that. I noticed a question pop up in the chat, which I already had in the back of my mind to move on to. And that's from Morgan, and it's asking how we can better bridge the barriers or gaps between your disciplines and make it easier for humanities and people from the humanities and science to communicate and collaborate.
I mean, cynically, I'm going to say funding.
So follow the money, yeah.
Yeah.
But I think it's always the students, you know, I've been a teacher, university teacher for a long time, and it's always the student pushing the agenda. I would say academia to me is always one generation behind. People like to think it's one generation ahead of everyone, but I think we teach things one generation behind. So it's always very good things coming out from every course I've had with, you know, ideas from students. So this is a very good idea. And if it can be integrated into compulsory seminars as part of the, you know, different disciplines, I think that's a very good idea. That could be brought up to presidents of universities and different committees.
I think just starting a dialogue is already a good thing, like as Sophia and I can already attest, you know, I think once you start these conversations and announce that these places are happening, it already builds interest, and clearly there's lots of people who want these dialogues to happen. And so I think it's willingness sometimes just to take that step and contact someone, you know, because research is, I imagine, Katie, a big part of the novel writing process anyway, and I don't see any reason why dialogue can't be a part of that. So I think that's a really important thing to take away tonight as well for everyone, is that you can reach out and that we can talk to each other across these boundaries. Which actually brings me to another question we had from the comments, which is, do you feel like there's a link between borders or edgelands and wilderness? And how might this link to rewilding, for example, wildlife corridors or spaces for nature in urban areas? You know, that's the kind of link that a lot of people are talking about, and this person's interested in terms of human relationships with nature and rewilding.
So I'm going to jump in there because I have noticed it's 3 minutes to 8, and I feel like that's like a 3-hour question just there talking about rewilding. It's a very contentious issue in Cumbria, certainly. I think personally, I come down on the side that I think rewilding for its own sake is problematic. There is a lot of corporate talk about rewilding at the moment that I've noticed over the past week or so with COP26, this thing of essentially buying up farmland, of traditional farmland, and planting it with trees, which feels completely counterproductive to me. Whereas I think a lot of what I support, I see a lot of great farmers locally who are incorporating more traditional farming methods, which have this element of wildness. I think wildness is, again, also a problematic term, because when you look at, you know, what's designated wilderness, and actually often it's when, you know, non-white, non-Western indigenous populations occupy a space or live in a space, that's often it's seen as wilderness for colonial purposes. So I think there's a whole thing that we could unpack there. For me, it's all about nuance. You know, how do we incorporate elements of rewilding within elements of traditional farming practices and traditional custodianship of the land around us? Birgitta, I don't know what you think about that.
I think you know, what you see here in Sweden is that through this pandemic, people have realized and been forced to move to work at home. And then they have often gone to their country houses. You can see a lot of journalists writing their articles. They sit in cottages somewhere in Värmland, or, you know, in the periphery. And they've started to have chickens, and, you know, they write about this. So maybe there is the start of a movement that people, more people leave Stockholm nowadays than come here, actually. The prices are going up as well for housing. So that's another factor. And but maybe this pandemic and the technology, the development of technology, and this, you never really know where technology will take us. Right now, with digitalization, people can work at home, and that some people will then move out of the cities.
I realize we're almost moving on to audience questions now, and if anyone has any more, please keep them coming. But I did notice in one of the questions that was asked, there was the term lack of human control, which sort of got me thinking about the idea that we had a shift in the way we do science now, whereas back in the day, I'm thinking of like the late 1800s, early 1900s, a lot of science was done to sort of understand the world better, whereas now a lot of the science we do is in a way more controlling. It's essentially to benefit human health, which is an important and a noble aspect of science. But this willingness to control the world around us has also led to some terrible consequences. So how do you see the concept of control, which is something you've both touched upon briefly in your respective disciplines, and do we in a way need to step or change the way that we view control or that we view progress?
We really work with wanting more control over facts. We want to monitor what's happening in the nature so we can be proactive, not reactive, which is something that has characterized this pandemic. I think most of us agree upon that. So by better monitoring, using light-footed networks in another way, etc., we should be able to be more proactive and protective of human health. That does not mean that we control nature. I'm just talking about human health now and what's happening, you know, the CO2 emissions, etc. That's another thing, but I'm just talking about what we as medical people can do to protect human health. And so control is not only negative, you know, you should have control over the right things. In our research, we have also involved citizen science, which is, you know, we don't need to have control in the way we're used to in structures. We can also ask citizens to participate. And I think that's, or in the Arctic, that's quite common. In Alaska, they do this a lot. And you can really trust these people because they are the most concerned, because it hits their very skin. So they are completely interested to participate. But then you lose the control of every step of the process. You just have to trust. So that's kind of a good thing about losing control.
Yeah, I think there's something that in what you were saying there that really reminds me of, makes me think of the kind of the practice of writing, that balance between control and seeking after understanding and seeking after knowledge, but also a relinquishing of the desire to sort of micromanage everything. Certainly for me, the writing process is always a balance of those two things. You know, you have to have an understanding of craft, and you know, writing is a craft as much as it is an art, but also there has to be a sense of just trusting yourself and trusting the capacity of the human unconscious and the human brain and the human mind and all the things that we gather with us. So yeah, just the way you were speaking there about research really just made me think about writing as well, and the similarities between what's needed and what's good to hold back on, I think, in a writing practice.
That's really interesting, thank you. And I realise we do have some unanswered questions, but we are now past 8 o'clock, so I think we might just have to thank everyone for their contributions, apologise for being over-enthusiastic hosts and monopolising too much of our speakers' times with our own interest. But I hope you all found at least some of your questions answered in our discussion. And if nothing else, I hope you see it as a good call to action for more of these. I'll hand over to Sophia now to wrap us up.
Yes, I definitely think we could keep speaking for ages, but we have gone a bit over time now, so I will wrap it up with a few thank yous. And Emily, if you have the chance to put up the slide, please. So as a wrap up, first and foremost, a huge thank you once again to Katie Hale and to Birgitta Evengård for your availability, your insight, and all the food for thought that you provided. I really think we will all step away from the screen with more knowledge and more inspiration than when we sat down. It was a really good discussion. A big thank you goes to the University of Glasgow's College of Medical Veterinary and Life Sciences for supporting us with a grant, and to the Glasgow Medical Humanities Network, in particular to Dr. Gavin Miller. Thank you to the Dear Green Bothy, which is a collaborative and cultural program from the University of Glasgow's College of Arts, which showcases creative and critical responses to climate emergency. A big thank you goes to the University of Glasgow's PhD Society, and in particular to Julia Kare, who helped me get in touch with those who became my fellow co-organizers of this event series. And of course, on that note, a huge thank you goes to Michael Dearwater for chairing this evening's event, and to all the other co-organizers of BioLit Talks, who are Lorna McBean, Emily Allen, Rachel Lewis, Patricia Rimby, and Cleo Dritza. You have all helped this event series come to life. And finally, a huge thank you to all of you who registered and attended this evening's event. It's been a wonderful turnout. Audience participation was great, and I really did not think we would spark the interest of so many of you. So thank you very much. If you would like to attend the future events, please consider registering for the following ones. You can use our QR code or the event link. And on a final note, once we end this call, a survey will appear in a browser window. If you'd like to complete it, it helps us understand if these type of events can keep happening in the future, and also it helps us understand where to improve. And the last thing to say is that for accessibility purposes, we have made a live transcript of this event, and rather than emailing it to all of you, if you would like a copy, please just let us know. The event has also been recorded and it will be publicly available. I think that is all. That's a wrap. It's been a wonderful evening. Thank you again, Katie and Birgitta, and thank you to everyone who attended. Good night to you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.